China wants authority beyond China's borders. Iran wants authority over international shipping. Russia wants authority over political speech. Meanwhile, the United States is fighting its own battles over elections, housing, technology, and national security. Those stories sound unrelated, but they are not. So they are all arguments about power. So let's start with China. A new Chinese law takes effect on July 1st. Beijing says people and organizations outside of China can face legal consequences if they are accused of undermining ethnic unity or supporting separatism. So think about that precedent. Most countries recognize the limits to their jurisdiction. China is signaling something different that's beyond the Iran war and what Trump can do. Beijing is telling the world that speech, research, activism, and political advocacy outside China could still become China's business as well. So Taiwan is an obvious example. A professor supporting Taiwan's independence, a lawmaker criticizing Chinese policy, or even a journalist covering sensitive issues. Under China's new framework, those activities could become targets. So this is one reason tensions grow between China and the West. The disagreement is not only about economics or between, conservatism or anything. The disagreement is about basic assumptions regarding sovereignty, free expression, and political authority. So when a government starts extending political pressure beyond its borders, other governments start to notice, such as the US. So now let's move to Iran. The Revolutionary Guard's Navy is rejecting an internationally coordinated shipping route in the Strait of Hormuz and demanding that vessels follow Iranian instructions instead. So this is a reminder of something people often forget. The geography still matters. And for all the talk about artificial intelligence, social media, and digital economies, the physical choke points remain among the most important places on Earth. So the Strait of Hormuz sits near the top of that list. So a major disruption there affects energy markets across the globe. So Iran understands this. Tehran does not need the strongest economy in the region. Tehran does not need the strongest military in the region. Tehran only needs enough influence to create uncertainty. Uncertainty drives up the costs. It changes the calculations. It gets the attention from the global news. So this is why freedom of navigation remains a core American interest. So whether you are talking about the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, or other major trade routes, open commerce depends on secure shipping lanes. So the next story brings us to technology. OpenAI has introduced Jalapeno, and its first custom AI chip developed with Broadcom. So the chip focuses on inference, which is the process of generating answers and responses from trained models. I'm kind of new to this, but OpenAI says the goal is greater efficiency, lower costs, and more control over infrastructure. So a few years ago, most people were discussing chatbots. Today, the conversation is moving towards the hardware. Why? Because computing power determines who wins. So every major AI company wants more control over the systems underneath the software. They want control over the chips, the servers, the networks, and the data centers. So this is becoming a modern version of the industrial competition and in the industrial age. So for decades, nations competed over steel production, oil production, and manufacturing capacity. Today, they are competing over computing capacity. So the winners gain economic advantages, the winners gain the military advantages, the scientific advantages, and technology remains important because technology drives productivity. Productivity drives wealth. Wealth brings influence. And that brings us to Alibaba. So Alibaba is suing the Pentagon after being placed on a list of companies linked to the Chinese military. Alibaba argues that the designation is unfair and unsupported, but the Pentagon argues that national security concerns justify this action. So this story matters because it highlights a major shift in American policy. For years, economic engagement with China operated under a simple assumption. The trade would reduce tensions, the trade would create cooperation, and the trade would encourage convergence. But many policymakers no longer believe these assumptions hold true with the state China is in right now. And instead, Washington increasingly views strategic industries through a national security lens at this point. Artificial intelligence, semiconductors, telecommunications, cloud computing, advanced manufacturing, these sectors are no longer viewed solely as business sectors. They are viewed as strategic assets. So you do not need to agree with every decision coming out of Washington, D.C. to recognize the trend. The trend is real. Now, let's talk about domestic politics. President Trump has delayed signing of bipartisan housing bill while pushing Congress to pass voter identification legislation. Supporters like myself see election integrity as a priority, and I personally think that the law should have been signed years ago, because it's not even a Republican policy, it's not a conservative policy, it's not a Democrat policy either. It is all just common sense. So critics see an unnecessary delay on the housing reforms. And the interesting part is not the disagreement itself. The interesting part is the political strategy. Trump believes voter identification remains a winning issue. Polling over the last several years has often shown significant public support for voter identification requirements. His calculation is quite simple, actually. He uses leverage while leverage exists right now, so Congress will decide whether that calculation works. Housing remains a major challenge across the country. Affordability remains a major concern due to companies like BlackRock. Supply remains limited in many regions. Local regulations remain a significant factor. Those politicians do not disappear because the politicians are fighting over another issue. The policy debate continues either way. Our final story today regards Russia. An opposition politician has been sentenced to 7 years in prison for social media posts criticizing the war in Ukraine. This story should not surprise anyone who has followed communist Russia over the last several years. The political space for opposition has narrowed and gone down to zero. The public criticism carries increasing risk over there. Independent voices face increasing pressure from these communist governments. And a government confident in its position rarely fears criticism, such as the U.S. And governments become sensitive to criticism when they believe criticism threatens stability. And Russia is not very stable at this point. History shows this pattern repetitively. The lesson is not unique to Russia. It goes through Cuba, North Korea, and most of these socialist nations. But every society benefits from institutions strong enough to tolerate disagreement. Strong institutions absorb criticism. Weak institutions fear criticism. So when you step back and look at today's headlines together, a pattern emerges. China wants broader authority. Iran wants broader influence. Russia wants tighter control. So American leaders are debating control over elections, technology, trade, and economic policy. Power remains the central issue. And the names change, the countries change, the technologies change, the underlying question stays the same. Who makes decisions? Who enforces decisions? Who limits the decisions? And those questions shaped history 100 years ago, and they still shape history today. And they will shape history tomorrow. So thanks for listening. God bless.